I'd just like to start things off by bringing your attention. Can you see the screen just to check? Yes, okay. So I would like to start things off by bringing your attention to a couple of different publications that we have on methane emissions. Methane emissions are really a key part of energy transitions. They can have a huge impact on the climate. They also bring benefits to health and safety, as we were hearing from Roland Coopers. And as I'm going to present here, and I think you've already heard a little bit about it, there's just a very strong economic case behind it. So this is a topic we have been looking into for a number of years, and three key publications I'd like to bring your attention to. The first one is the IEA Global Methane Tracker 2022. This provides detailed estimates of methane emissions from the energy sector for last year, 2021. And these incorporate the latest evidence from scientific literature, measurement campaigns, and also satellite data, which we just heard a lot and in great detail about. Now, the Global Methane Tracker also provides detailed information on abatement measures for the oil and gas sector and what are the different costs that are related to them, and what are the policies that different countries are using to tackle methane emissions. The second publication I'd like to bring your attention to is called Curtailing Methane Emissions from Fossil Fuel Operations. And this identifies different actions and initiatives that can deliver a 75% cut in these emissions by 2030. And just so that you have this in mind, this is what happens in our net zero emission scenario by 2050. So this is really what we need to see happening in the next couple of years. It's a major reduction, and it's very much possible, as we have already heard. And so in this publication, we talk about the different types of policies, the different types of measures, both focused on the domestic markets, but also at international measures, how you can deal with trade flows, how you can work with partners, and also what the industry can do and what are the different industry initiatives in this area. And then the third report I'd like to talk about is the regulatory roadmap and toolkit. This is a detailed how-to guide for policymakers and regulators seeking to cut methane emissions. So there we outline both the process of developing a framework to tackle methane emissions, but also what are the different tools, what are the essential elements of regulation, how you can manage monitoring, reporting, and verification, and how you can adapt your legislation to new technologies, and so on and so forth. Now, what has been happening with methane emissions in the last years? The fossil fuel sector, and you can see here the split between coal, oil, and natural gas, it has been increasingly emitting more and more methane. There was a slight drop in this increase in 2020, mostly because of the pandemic. We had a drop in the production of fossil fuels, and this also meant that emissions associated with these activities dropped a little bit. But last year we saw a rebound as economies rebounded, as fossil fuel production and demand rebounded, so did methane emissions. And it might be worth pointing out that when we looked at in comparison to 2019, actually emissions are at slightly lower level than 2019, whereas oil, coal, and natural gas production are above pre-pandemic levels. So this means that this indicates that some action on methane is happening, but it's just happening at a very, very slow pace. And it's really striking that this is the case, because we see such a tightness of the gas markets. We see such a huge importance for climate. And if we could tackle all of these leaks and bring them to markets, this would mean about 180 billion cubic meters of additional gas. So it's really a huge wasted opportunity. And naturally, this is 2021 emissions are very, very far off the roadmap and where we need to be for a net zero emission scenario. And essentially what the net zero emission scenario shows and sees for oil and gas production and operators in this area is that we take all available action to address methane emissions And these are basically measures that are already known today. So this doesn't rely on innovation, on developing new technology, and certainly it will become easier and easier to tackle methane emissions in the future as we see new instruments like the new satellites that are coming online, but also different abatement technologies. But what we see in this scenario is essentially that all operators move to the point where the best operators are today. And there's really a huge difference in what we see in terms of operations. Here we see methane emissions from oil and gas, and these are the top emitters here, and you see Russia and the United States, they come out front. But then there are several other large emitters. But I think the most interesting thing about this chart is the intensity of methane emissions. And this is the amount of methane that is released by a certain unit of production of oil and gas. And you just see such a huge difference in the performance of different countries. This is in fact the difference of more than 100. So if you see some of our worst emitters, some of our worst performance, like Turkmenistan and Venezuela, they are more than 100 times worse than some of our best emitters like Norway or the Netherlands. So naturally, each country has got specific characteristics. It has specific types of resources. So if you look to Norway, they have a lot of large offshore oil and gas wells. And this means that for some of the reasons that we heard from Will Coopers, I mean, this is offshore, the safety of operations is really a prime concern, but also because of some of the measures that Norway has been taking to tackle methane emissions for a number of years now, including taxing emissions from venting and methane emissions related to flaring. So there are different conditions. Maybe not everyone can get to the level of performance that Norway has nowadays, but operators can certainly move in that direction. And just to give a figure, if all countries had the same methane emissions intensity as Norway has today, methane emissions from oil and gas operations globally would fall by more than 90%. So this really shows that methane emissions is not something, it's not a challenge that we can't overcome. We already have the tools. It's already a reality in many places. We just really need to deploy best practices to manage methane emissions and take it seriously. And I'll be brief here because we have already learned a lot about what satellites can deliver and what they can't deliver, and also what the future might hold. But I'd just like to point that they are really a very important development. We are now capable of seeing at least very large leaks in a number of different regions. You can see here the orange dots, and we see a lot of methane emissions from oil and gas operations near the Permian Basin in Texas, but also in parts of Central Asia. Turkmenistan responds for over a third, or about a third, of all the large leaks detected by satellites last year. And the satellites can also provide us information on other types of leaks from human activities, such as emissions from coal mines or waste, and even agriculture. And this is some of the leaks you can see near India and China. But as we heard from Johannes, satellites don't provide the end solution to this. They will help us a lot. They are already helping us a lot, and they will provide us with more and more information. But there are still a number of challenges. The reason why you don't see methane any dots here on the ocean is because they aren't capable right now of providing good readings in offshore areas. Similarly, if you look at the northern areas, it's very hard to detect there because of the high latitudes, or because operations are in snowy or ice-covered areas. We have also heard about the issue of cloud cover. In many tropical regions, you can't detect methane emissions right now because they are constantly clouded, or because they are surrounded by rainforests. So there are a number of blind spots, but satellites, they certainly are a very important tool, and we need to complement these two with some ground-based measurements, or even aero measurements, but that are based on drones or airplanes, on other monitoring methods. And now I'd like to turn a bit to emissions from Romania. And here you can see the marginal abatement cost curve for oil and gas emissions in this country. And this is based on average natural gas prices from 2017 to 2021. So I don't have the precise figures, but I imagine for EU gas price, this would be something like $10 or maybe $8 for MBTU. And in such a context, about 40% of the current leaks could be abated at no net cost. And this essentially means that you will spend some amount of money with the capital investments, with the operational investments to undertake the measures such as installing a plunger or undertaking blowdown capture or vapor recovery units or leak detection and repair programs. And the savings, so the amount of methane that you will capture with these measures, will provide enough gas that you can market, and then you can have a revenue that essentially covers your cost. Now, if we look at current gas prices in the European Union, which are well over $20 per MBTU, essentially all of the measures that we see in the chart are cost effective. Even the measures such as downstream leak detection and repair programs, which are a little bit costlier because of the nature of these operations. They are often long pipelines. It's not necessarily easy to cover all of them. And so there's a cost associated with that. But even these measures, when we take into account the current gas prices, they would come at no net cost. They would be very cost effective. So there's a really strong case for methane abatement. And considering all of the other aspects, the need for a higher supply and security regarding this gas environment, there's no reason why we wouldn't undertake all of these measures in a really, really short time frame. And we have looked at what are the different policies and also at what companies are doing to do this. And it is encouraging to see that some action is happening. Recently, we saw from the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative goal to essentially get to zero methane emissions. So this is akin to the zero routine flaring goal, but it aimed at methane emissions. And what this means in practice is not that we're going to be able to avoid every single leak and that we will leak zero methane, but it is essentially that we will bring emissions to a very low level. So let's say under 0.2% of all the gas that is produced ends up being leaked. So this is a challenge that operators and companies, they take the issue of methane emissions as seriously as they take the issue of safety. And it's entirely doable. But at the same time, we haven't seen that much on the ground movement from different companies to deploy these abatement technologies that already exist and they are very effective. So we will also need some policies and some regulations to make sure that the action that needs to be taken is taken at the scale and at the pace required. And we are seeing positive signs from the European Union. They have a methane strategy, they have a proposed regulation, and it includes many of the key tried and tested approaches that we see here, which are essentially policies and measures that have already been deployed in multiple jurisdictions with very positive results. They don't require very robust monitoring systems, which are a very important part of the solution and will be needed to drive the full abatement potential and bring about the additional policies that will be needed up to 2030. But they require a bit of time to be implemented. I think that's a part of what the EU is thinking about, and it's definitely in their proposed regulation. But alongside with that, we can take measures now that don't require these robust systems to bring down emissions. And these include leak detection repair programs. There are also some technology standards. So essentially, you do not operate with technologies that are not best practice, so to speak, or you have a time frame to adapt to these technologies so that you don't have equipment that is constantly leaking, and then zero routine flaring venting. So for Romania in particular, you can see here on the chart that leak detection and repair would be the most important measure. It alone would be able to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector by over a quarter. So over 25% of emissions from Romania could be avoided through leak detection and repair programs. So even if there's some uncertainty over emissions levels, even if there's a lot of work to do on MRV, there's no reason to delay action to reduce emissions. There's no reason we can't already start undertaking leak detection and repair programs. These will be important for the safety of operations, for the climate, for health, and they will generally be very cost effective. So we hope that countries look to that and companies also start to implement these measures. The Global Methane Pledge launched last year at COP was a very important moment in essence, global aspiration to reduce global methane emissions from human activities by 30%. And we at the IEA, we think that the energy sector should be at the forefront of the efforts to achieve this goal. Measures in the energy sector, and in particular in the oil and gas sector, they can reduce a lot of emissions quickly and cost effectively. So I think I'll end there, and happy to. Yeah, I think that my initial impression from the EU proposed regulation is that it has all of the major components to start taking important action on this field. I don't believe that it will be, we will solve all of the problems, but it certainly puts into effect all of the key short-term strategies. So having a robust monitoring, reporting, and verification scheme, having measures to deal with flaring and venting, and having measures to deal with fugitive emissions, including leak detection and repair programs. Those, if those come into effect in the timeframes that they are proposing, then we could see maybe something like a 50% reduction up to 2025, which would be in line with our scenarios, like the sustainable development scenario or the net zero emission scenario. To drive further action to get to the full abatement potential, then we would need further measures. But I believe that in the short term, the proposed regulation would already be a very important first step.